Well, thank you very much, Dominic, for very, very comprehensive, actually summarization of fourth industrial revolution and its current status and its implications. Well, this session is supposed to be wrap-up, concluding session. And throughout this morning and up to now, there's so many things have been said, very, very useful for policymakers and corporate level decision makers and in consumers and all individuals as well. However, this session, what I would like to have the panels to do is to focus on Korea. Although during their presentations, they did come up with various suggestions for policymakers and the corporate decision makers. But this session, again, I would like to re-emphasize or re-highlight again what they would like to recommend to policymakers and the corporate level decision makers. Actually, all the panelists have been introduced before except two. We have Dr. An, who is a research fellow, and actually he is in charge of KDI's industry and the services economy area research, the analysis. So he is sitting there. Actually, his boss, Dr. Kim Jung-kyung, and president of KDI, was supposed to be sitting here with us, but again, he has to go to National Assembly, the Budget Committee. So you know our very clear national priority, not on this kind of important. But anyway, so Dr. An is with us, and then the last and not the least, Mr. Lee Jae-yong, who used to be our National Assemblyman, is one of aspiring young political leaders. In fact, he used to work with the Professor Schwab and the World Economic Forum before he returned to Seoul to become a politician. Well, with this, I will ask panelists to just make an initial remark of 5 or 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so. Since Dominic just said, so why don't you with...
So maybe we can show the slides, that would be nice. Oh yeah, there they are. So I don't know how many of you followed the presentation of this morning, actually. So I thought about a few specific challenges that all these technological transformations bring for South Korea, or may bring for South Korea. I mean, lots of this is speculation, of course. So, but here's what I thought about. So, I think, and I alluded to this morning, is that what we might see due to all these transformations is that we observe some kind of localization of production, reshoring trends, where several production steps are being brought back to the countries where consumers are. And now Korea is a country that relies very heavily on upstream producers from other Asia, as far as I see it. So this is a chart from an OECD study where you see the global value chain participation across countries, and you see for once that Korea is strongly participating in global value chains. Only Luxembourg is actually participating more in it, which is natural because it's a tiny country. But for Korea, the global value chain participation is extremely important. And to a large extent, to a majority of the extent, it's relying on backward participation. So it's relying on upstream producers, which, to my knowledge, mostly come from other Asian countries. Now, keeping this in mind, when you consider that technological transformations might lead to a reshoring of production to other countries, maybe back to Europe, maybe back to the US, we will see a declining demand for labor-intensive production, particularly here in Asia. And the question is this a risk for the Korean industry in the sense that maybe the business model goes away, right? You can no longer rely on these producers. It will be critical for Korea, I think, to invest in these technologies as well to make sure that they will not be left behind when other producers are taking production home. So as I said, this is really a thought, right? This is not. That doesn't mean that must actually happen. So another point I looked at is this questions of chaebols. How do you chaebols? Yeah. Versus micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. So I think the question that's important is who really drives innovation, because as we've learned this morning from Karl Frey's presentation, there are important local multiplier effect of innovation jobs. So it will be very important to be the innovator, and the question is, who is it? Is it the big corporations, the chaebols, or is it the micro, small, medium-sized enterprises? And how do you make them innovative? And what I've learned also this morning is that maybe Korea is investing a bit too much in SMEs and keeping them alive maybe for too long, even if they're not the good companies. So here I think policy will be asked to find a good balance to really find out who's the innovator and help them in their business. So and finally, it seems to be a big issue here, and I was surprised to see how much Korea actually does in terms of education. How much thought is put into how we can teach people creativity, social skills, and how we can teach them to deal with change. And Dominique Barton just mentioned that too, that you're working on that in Canada. I'd be very curious to hear how this can be done and what the lessons are. But I think this is essential, and because these are, after all, the tasks that cannot be automated, at least not in the near future. And I think it would be a good idea, not only for South Korea but for every country to make sure that the workforce is prepared like that. So these were my special challenges for Korea.
Okay. Why don't we go a round of presentations first and then have interactions? Okay. Now, Dr. An, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sagong. I would like to share with you some details, because all the big pictures are already well presented throughout the sessions this morning and this afternoon. It is on the evolution of industrial policy in Korea. Even though we are talking about industrial revolution, Korea's response to all the challenges can be better understood as an evolution. And then afterwards, I would like to point out that we have some serious issues to be addressed. Yes, I would like to talk briefly about structural transformation in Korea, and I will show you some details about evolution in industrial policy in Korea, and afterwards I will present some policy challenges. First, this figure shows that up until 1990, Korean employment in manufacturing and services were increasing in both sectors. But since the 1990s, manufacturing employment started to shrink while services continued to grow. But more recently, after 2009, we show that temporarily manufacturing employment is also increasing. But it will not last for long, because I think we are in the trend of shrinking manufacturing and growing services. And the issue here is that while manufacturing is known to be quite productive and competitive worldwide, our service sector has not been performing well. But now the issue is that it will be nice if we are very good at manufacturing. If we could become a little bit better on services, how better it would be. But the question is not like that. If we cannot transform ourselves and we cannot make services productive enough, manufacturing itself will be in the crisis. Why? That's the main idea of the fourth industrial revolution. The wall between manufacturing and services are disappearing. Here we show you, I can show that the long-term trend of manufacturing declining in all the other advanced countries. In case of Korea, manufacturing employment is shrinking while manufacturing output or manufacturing value added are not shrinking yet. And at the same time, you can see that in the US, in Japan, in Germany, service sector has been expanding. In case of Korea, we are following their footprints, but the speed of service expansion in terms of output is far slower than expansion of services in employment, which means our labor productivity in service sectors are stagnant or even declining. As a result, OECD statistics show that labor productivity of services relative to that in manufacturing is declining very rapidly in case of Korea. Korea seems to be Korea is here. So the gap between manufacturing and service in terms of productivity is the biggest in Korea. That's the background. I will skip all the other part before going over to the policy issues. But one thing that I want to show you is that in the 1960s, Korea was exporting iron ore, tungsten ore, raw silk, anthracite, this kind of coal, and cuttlefish. Now, year 2000, we are exporting semiconductors, computers, automobiles, petrochemical products, and ships. So we made very rapid and radical structural transformation. And also our policy response to this change was also changing a lot. This is about evolution of industrial policy. Well, these days, industrial policy is not a popular word. I started my career at OECD, and I wrote a report, and the conclusion part has a term called industrial policy, and my boss advised me to erase it. Not a good word. The reason why industrial policy is not a good word these days is that in the 1940s and 50s, many countries, developing countries, tried industrial policy. Not only Korea, but also in many other countries wanted to have their own steel mill. Even they wanted to have their own automobile factory, but most of them failed. Korea made success. So Korea is kind of exception. And since the 1970s, people started to realize that, well, government intervention creates problems than solving them. But more recently, the focus of discussion has been shifted. What would be smarter way of policy making in terms of promoting industrial transformation? In this context, industrial policy in Korea can be summarized in 4 terms, in my view. First, in case of Korea, industrial policy has clean goal, which was promoting export. And it provided a good monitoring and evaluation tool because we had one clear goal, which is maximizing export. So if a firm hits the goal of exporting certain amount, they continue to receive support from the government. And this performance indicator was a real-time indicator, and the review was made annually. That's why in some other countries, the government wanted to pick winners, but they were stuck with losers for many years. But Korea could avoid that issue because we had good monitoring and evaluation. And thirdly, industrial policy in Korea had rapid evolution. Whenever we detected problems, we changed it rapidly. And finally, industrial policy in Korea was a successful public-private partnership. The government set the goal, but it was the private sector who achieved them. These are detailed diagram for the produced by Planning Office of Heavy and Chemical Industry Promotion Council in the 1970s. actually it's 1976, they set the 6 core industries to be promoted, and we had many detailed tools. I'll skip them. In the 1970s, the government wanted to promote heavy and chemical industries, and it was in the 1970s, all the industrial policy tools were hired. If you want to know what tools a government can use, look at Korea in the 1970s. We have everything there. But it also created huge problems, including high inflation, and we had 2 oil shocks, so we were in crisis. In the 1980s, we had to make a big change, 180-degree turnaround from the previous approach. Actually, that change was made, one of the leaders who made such big change was Chairman Sagong. We made a big change from a growth-oriented approach to stabilization and government-led growth to private sector-led growth. And actually, it was quite, in the 1980s, some advanced countries wanted to start privatization, regulation, and everything, like in England and the US. And Korea was at the frontier in that change. It's quite amazing. And as a result, for example, this trend in R&D expenditure show that from 1980s, our R&D expenditure, share of R&D in GDP has been increasing fast, but it was not driven by public R&D, but by private R&D. I will skip the detail, but what I want to say is that Korean government played a very important role in economic development, and whenever we started to have problems, we were very quick at solving them. And hopefully, I will mention policy challenges in Korea now, and I hope that we could be able to solve them quickly. One example is the core industry in Korea, as I mentioned in the previous chart, is now semiconductors and telecommunication equipment, shipbuilding, steel, and petrochemical. And shipbuilding and steel industry, we are in big problem. Global excess capacity because of heavy investment made in China. One example is shipbuilding industry, and you can see that historically, this blue line shows the market share of European countries. In 1965, Japan became #1 country in shipbuilding. In 1999, Korea became #1 country in shipbuilding. From 2010, China is #1 country. So we have severe competition in this industry. And here you can see that more recently, after year 2000, Korea has been the leading country in shipbuilding, caught up by rapid growth in China. And Japan has been declining a little bit, but they are coming back. In this sector, the problem is that because of the global trade slowdown after global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, now the problem is this global trade is slowing down while total world fleet of ships continue to grow. And when global trade slows down, seaborne trade will also slow down. So we have huge excess capacity in shipping and shipbuilding. That will create a big problem for Korea. Probably this month, the government will announce some plan how to deal with shipbuilding industry. And one thing you can see is that the demand for shipbuilding is closely related with real oil price. And now we see that real oil price is very low. Now it's around 50. So we will have tough future ahead. And we can talk about yard closures and restructuring. That is a big issue for Korea now. And one way out of this problem is that how can we upgrade core industries, taking advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. Final question is, are we ready for that? This is a figure already introduced to you in the morning session, which is Korea, the ranking of readiness in the fourth industrial revolution. Number one country is Switzerland, Singapore, Netherlands, Finland, US, UK. But it's from the white paper by a World Economic Forum. Korea is now very low. And especially one issue is this labor structure flexible. Korea ranked as 83rd country in the world. And this is a problem not only in new industries, but also in dealing with this excess capacity in core industry. We have the same issue. We should deal with this. It's a very urgent issue. And another information is that in terms of some infrastructure, like patents in the area of Internet of Things or patents in the area of big data, Korea actually is doing well, doing okay. We belong to the top 5 or top 7 countries. The problem is, and also the global share of industrial robots, Korea is also among top countries. Korea is here. So in terms of hardware, we seem to be well prepared. But already mentioned by Greg, the penetration rate of cloud computing in Korea seems to be slightly higher than 6%. That's a big issue. Right? So in terms of hardware, we are well prepared, but in terms of software or in terms of practices, we have some problems. One thing, finally, I want to mention this issue. I know why cloud computing is not widely used in Korea. One reason is that it's related with regulation. I'm working for KDI. KDI is semi-public institution. We are not allowed to use, to get access to cloud server from our offices. Even these days, I'm not allowed to get access to Gmail. They are all related with security reason. Probably all the government officials, they cannot use Gmail in their offices. So we need to change our attitude, approach. We need to make big change in our software. That's my final point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. By the way, you know, what made up our 10 largest export items in early 1960s? Actually, Dr. Han mentioned the squid, with iron ore, tungsten, anthracite, raw silk, and squid. And the total export volume was about 40, 50 million. And then we reached export $100 million mark in 1964. Since then, we started to celebrate our export day, which later changed to trade day. Actually, I played a role when I was senior secretary. I said, we are a trading country, not just export country. So we made it a trading day. And so it's $100 million in 1964, which made up all this. And then today. So it tells us and tells the world that what the right policies and the right strategies can do to a country. I think Korea is really, you know, economies cannot put into lab situation, but Korea, two Koreas, North Korea, South Korea, as late as early 1960s, per capita income of North Korea was twice as high as that of South Korea. Now South Korea is about $30,000. North Korea maybe, officially I think they say somewhere around 1,200 or something like that, but I think well below $1,000. So it is really the exemplifying case what the right policies and strategy can do. That's why actually when I thought about organizing this conference was exactly because of that. If you look out 20, 30 years' time, I think unless you do right things now, we will be really, really sorry. That's why I wanted to get more public attention and policymakers' attention. That's why I gathered this good group, and we have this very good the media present here. So I just hope Korean people as a whole, and particularly politicians, legislatures, pay attention to this. And then I just wanted to say that industrial policy was mentioned. Actually, when people talk about industrial policy, it's a narrowly defined industrial policy. That's the way I interpret it. What I mean narrowly defined industrial policy is picking the winners type of industrial policy, which is not generally accepted nowadays. And if you do that, you'll be subject to countervailing duties and anti-dumping charges and so forth. So you're not allowed to do that under the WTO regime. But in any case, however, another type of widely defined industrial policies, what Dr. Han mentioned, is what I would call functional industrial policy, which is okay, assist R&Ds and so forth, rather than direct subsidy and so forth. But anyway, just a clarification of semantics. Okay, now let me ask Gregory Orland.
So I guess in my earlier comments, I made a bunch of, or several recommendations for Korea specifically. But I'd like to highlight three particular notes that I think are of high import. The first is, and I think Dr. Ahn really hit the nail on the head when he made the point about the low cloud penetration, is the importance of changing the cultural landscape in Korea towards the use of cloud technologies. I think security is often used as a rationale for not embracing cloud adoption. And I think there are real concerns around security whenever data is moved from one place to another. But I think that is oftentimes a false reason for not adopting the cloud. And I think it's important that we highlight that, because while I think Mr. Barton's comments on what John Holdren said around the use, or there are companies who have been hacked and there are companies who don't know they've been hacked, I think that there's another dichotomy you can draw, and that is there are companies that have expertise in security, and there are companies that do not have expertise in security. And I'm afraid to say that most industrial companies do not have expertise in security. And so I would actually venture to say that many times data is safer in the cloud because you have your data managed by experts than having it managed by the person who happened to have security assigned to them at a certain industrial player. So that is I think it's important that Korea embrace the cloud, and it's going to be a tough transition, particularly at the policy level, but something that needs to happen. The second point I'd like to make is that data is what will fuel the next industrial revolution. I think there's a lot of discussion around collecting data. I think Mr. Barton made a really good point about the F1 cars and how they can generate 2 gigabytes per lap. I think in many factories we can see gigabytes or terabytes per minute come off of these measurement systems, and only the best data stored in the best way, analyzed well, is going to actually yield any real results. And I think that's important to think about, because unless you admit that and start treating data as a first-class citizen of the industrial world, you're actually not going to harvest any of the benefits of this fourth industrial revolution. And the third thing, and I've heard it mentioned several times in the context of education, but I'd like to broaden it, is the idea of incentivizing agility. I think Korea has a very interesting set of business models in the chaebol. I think there are some huge opportunities there because of the vertical integration that exists, as I talked about before. But the reality is the rigidity that exists within them can also be a major source of liability. And so what I would suggest is that incentivizing people to break those business models, even in small ways to start with, could yield great results. As a personal example, the reason my company, Citrine, got started was because I worked in the materials industry and was unsatisfied with how we were analyzing data. I was collecting gigabytes a day and doing nothing with it. And in Silicon Valley, which we've mentioned several times, we have the opportunity to break business models and try new things, and maybe we're not lauded if we fail, but given the opportunity to really branch out and embrace new technologies. And I think that is going to be a critical step for Korea to take on, to be able to break these older business models, these legacy business models, and embrace these new models of industry. I guess I just leave you with the idea that 10 years from now, these tools and technologies that we're talking about today are going to be like spreadsheets are for the finance industry. When spreadsheets first came out, I'm sure they were seen as threatening, or what will we do, what will people do with their time? And if you ask any of my business school classmates or any financier any of you knows, I'm sure they would say finance probably didn't exist before spreadsheets did. These tools are the things that are going to power the future, and the way we analyze and handle our data today is going to pave that path, whether it's for Korea or the rest of the world. So the real question is not whether this is going to happen, but whether Korea is going to be at the forefront or learn the hard way that these changes came and have to play a game of catch-up. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now let me invite Mr. Lee.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. These are great panelists that I probably wouldn't have any opportunity to be with normally. Listening to today's conversation, it seems that from the morning through the afternoon, a lot of people suggested that how important the policymaking is in making this fourth industrial revolution a real in Korea. And now I see, from my own experience, I see a couple of challenges. Number one is that, Mr. Dominic Barton said he saw more business model changes or new business models over the past 24 months or 2 years compared to his 28 years in McKinsey combined. That's very fast, I presume, and that's the tenacity and velocity of this change is, it's great. But if you're asking a government, Korean government, or I would say any governments in the world, pushing through one piece of legislation takes about 7 years. I mean, for me, when I started in 2012, I put up my first legislation, which got passed at the end, but it passed in 2016. So it took me 4 years of hard work to push one simple legislation. So if you're looking at the Korean policy or lawmakers' decision-making process, we are simply asking something really difficult to happen. Then, what can we do about it? I presume these type of conferences is very important to raise the awareness. I think maybe there are some creative ways to go around current systemic problem that we have in politics to bring these changes about. But simply to say, the changes that we want from the political side or policymaker side will not happen at the speed that you're asking for. And second, it brings to actually next challenge, which is that as a lawmaker, and especially in the democratic world, where we have to go through the vote, the election every 2-3 years, we're challenged every day walking out our doorstep from our public. I would say, basket of very simple yet difficult questions. So, for example, one question about this fourth industrial revolution could be, is this another satanic mills or a holy grail? I'm not trying to raise any or start a religious debate, especially for those who's familiar with Blake's poem. But the thing is, we don't know. Looking at some of the slides that I saw this morning, it already poses some of the questions that these public would ask. So first session, I saw Dr. Frey's, I think it was Dr. Frey, who put up a slide showing the revenue comparison of Detroit and Silicon Valley. Similar revenue, yet it takes much fewer people to create. I presume that means there are much more wealth going to fewer people today than before. Now, when I saw McKinsey's slide in that same session, it said about 20 to 30% of the jobs that exist today will disappear, will change. But it'll be simply replaced by another job. So overall, we're going to have about the same amount of job. But yet, you have to ask question, what's going to happen to those people who are going to lose a job, or are they going to really transit into the new jobs that are being created? A lot of people are saying No. And actually, if you look at some of the debates that we're having around this issue, so we talk a lot about how low skill and low pay versus high skill and high pays. But real challenging questions that I cannot answer, which I am faced many times, is high skilled people getting low pay. They're very afraid that these new challenges, with their education, with their experience, where they will have absolutely no place in this world, while they're, now we talked about the longevity of life because of new technological change, and they're retiring at 60 or even younger these days. And what are they going to do about the next 30 years? They're highly educated, they're used to high pay, but yet this new world will not allow them to have any job or very low paying jobs. So I think as a policymakers, we know it's going to happen, and we know it's happening. We've heard it many times. Yet we are faced with these real everyday challenges of how to solve these problems. Now, I think it's policymakers' homework and it's their jobs to think more critically. I think we need more policymakers, maybe from McKinsey or any consulting, jobs, who knows how to solve problems. But our democratic system also doesn't really allow that to happen all the time. But if I have to say, then throwing out all these, very big questions, what can Korea do at this point? One of the things that I heard this morning or this entire day is that we really need to pay attention what future skills and future jobs are going to look like. How are we going to prepare future generation, basically? And I use this analogy a lot, but I have a 4-year-old kid at home. And when I look at this child, my son, I'm thinking in 15 years, at current education system, he's going to have to take the college entrance test. And my challenge as a parent, and any parents in Korea who's preparing their child for these very harsh, rigorous process of taking this test, whether he will or not take the test actually in 15 years. I'm thinking, with all these changes that it's going to happen, and they say it's imminent, and that is absolute, that my child, if he takes that test, which means the Korean education system has completely failed to transform into new education system to prepare these young generation, or I have completely failed as a parent to show this child a new way to learn. May that be in Korea or outside, but whatever it is, the education system that we have today in Korea will simply not be able to prepare our next generation to this new challenges that we will have. I think it's going to be, I would like to believe this is a holy grail, because it seems that no matter what, it's going to increase the pie, as it did over the past 3 generations, or past 3 revolutions. Now, as policymakers and politicians, we must think about how those wealth can be allocated maybe not evenly, but at least reasonably among all population. And for that reason, I think private sector also, who is driving these challenges or these changes, to jump in and not only ask for what policymakers can do, but with your nimbleness and with your flexibility and creativity, also make those suggestions of how we can solve these sort of philosophical questions. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Lee, again, highlighted the important national agenda of educational reform and, in fact, he didn't say specifically, but labor market reform to make labor market flexible enough so that as jobs continuously disappear and created, new jobs can be found by the workers. So this labor market flexibility and education as reform all go hand in hand. And in the context of fourth industrial revolution, I think this is two important key areas. Actually, we can talk more about this, and I have a few things to say about it as well. Now, saving John for the concluding remark of this concluding session. So why don't I save you? And then why don't I ask Dominic, you want to add some more to what you have said?
Well, I'm going to take advantage of this new tradition of sitting still, which has the advantage of my not having to cart my computer around because my notes are here because I've been making some notes. There are three themes that I want to emphasize. The first is one of promotion, which really is the issue of Korea pursuing its strategies of making sure that the infrastructure and the resources for advanced computing are widely available. We've heard, and I think it's important, one of the aspects of that is dealing with the security problem so one doesn't have fear of the security problem, but dealing with the security problem for real, because this infrastructure of IoT is extremely vulnerable. Many of you may have noticed that last week in the United States there was a denial of service activity that basically, I'm going to exaggerate by saying, was done through children's toys. It was done through marginal aspects of it. Was not core computing resources. It was all those refrigerators that suddenly started being asked to talk to each other. So the security problem is real, and I think Greg's point is very important. Anyone at Google would insist, to a point of being willing to make a bet of a personal fortune, that they could protect your data, if you're an industrial company, better than you can. And I think, therefore, it's really a serious matter of looking what constitutes security and how to achieve it as a society. And there is no simple answer, but it is crucial. A related issue in the promotion here is what is the cost of access of the connection facilities? Since, in fact, in the mobile telephony, in the cell phone world, the interconnect rules become crucial, and they become quite crucial in this era of data. And dominant players can oftentimes want to set rules in a way that means that their competitors don't have easy interconnect access, but that means their customers have higher prices. I'm fairly sure that that's actually a debate going on right now in Korea. So let me just leave that particular observation to say how that debate is resolved. The pricing of those resources is important. The second thing that I would turn to is this debate about regulation or re-regulation. And I would say let's approach it with some care. I would start with two observations. One is that a colleague of mine and a friend of Kenji's and mine wrote a rather brilliant book about the Japanese economy, which is called Freer Markets, More Rules. That is, the question is, how do you end up with flexibility? How do you end up with functioning markets? The issue isn't just doing away with rules. The question is, what are the rules that you need for a particular moment in a particular economy? So his book ultimately was about the re-regulation of the Japanese economy. So I would suggest here we really need to think through what are the re-regulations that we require for this particular era. That turns to a second observation of that, which is that a number of years ago in the United States, a very good book was written that some of you may know by Larry Lessig, called Code and Other Rules and Other Laws of Cyberspace. He's a constitutional lawyer, taught at Harvard and at Stanford, but what he was really saying is the code that gets written in a platform, in an algorithm, is binding. And you can pass any law you want, but if it doesn't pay attention to what the code is driving to be done, it's irrelevant. And that therefore the question really becomes not just whether we deregulate, but do we deregulate in a way that means those algorithms that are not that are private algorithms intrude into areas that should be public discussion and debate. who writes the algorithms, who reviews them. So we often say that in the platform era, this rise of the platform economy, that there really is a debate between, or an inherent tension between public and private governance. Public governance and private governance, and how do we reconcile those two different, there isn't a winner or a loser, there's really a question of how we find reconciliation. And I think that's all the more important. Those of you who work in Silicon Valley or have associations there have heard, I am certain, the mantra, the chant that comes out of Silicon Valley with new startups, the thousands of startups that, Dominique, that you're referring to that are undermining business models, which is, don't ask permission, ask forgiveness. Well, that's okay if you're not making a blood testing device. So a company like Theranos in the Valley makes a blood testing device that doesn't work right. Okay? So the question again becomes, we need a more flexible, there's no debate about that, no argument. But the question of how we get there is we have to rethink these rules and significantly, in that sense, rewrite them. And it isn't enough just to say, we believe in privacy, the same rules apply in cyberspace. Because unless we write the law in a way that deals with the code, it won't. The third point, and the last that I want to make, comes to this issue of workers. We were talking earlier about the need to promote, augment intelligence, promote workers. There are really two aspects to this. On the one hand, there really does need to be labor market flexibility. And I was, as I said, very encouraged this morning to hear the discussion of flexible security. For those of you who don't know, it's a notion that really comes out of the Danish policy world, in which the idea really is that unions consciously gave up certain claims to restrict labor market operations in exchange for real assurance that their workforces would be protected and taken care of. So that really part of the question is, what is the social bargain that is going to be struck about this? It isn't whether you have welfare policy or don't have welfare policy. It's what's the social bargain about how those who in fact are benefiting and are driving this process work with those who is in the shipbuilding industry are being left behind. How do we deal with this rather basic problem? Part of it is purely economic, and part of it, as we were saying at lunch, is cultural. People's lives are changed, and when their lives are changed, they become quite distressed. Part of it's being an asset to be promoted then comes to the questions that are being asked. What does the education system need to look like? What kinds of skills do people need to have to be able to effectively apply these technologies? And I thought another point that was made this morning and I thought was extremely important was that it's not just a mastery of the math or the tools. Domain knowledge matters. I mean, you know, Greg's company, we pick on Greg because he's sitting right here, but I mean, his company depends on the fact that he actually is a material scientist. He actually knows something about materials. All of that ability to manage data would be of no relevance and no importance without that. So part of the question becomes, what domains can a country encourage? The point that was being made, I grew up in an agricultural area, so that, you know, applying these kinds of knowledge to farming, to agriculture is a perfect instance of how we can improve all that. And the last point I would simply make is, in some ways, there's a whole array of things governments have to do. I mean, they have to build roads. They have to provide, in our era, Social Security in some form. They have to provide some forms of medical care in most societies. That's not a debate. But in fact, the question is, can that provision of those functions which governments have democratically agreed are basic to what they need to do be used to help and drive innovation in these areas by setting the terms and standards on which that provision is done, setting the character and terms of the kinds of technologies that might be deployed. So those four areas, I think, promoting access, you know, the question of what do we really mean by regulation and deregulation, taking care of workforces, and letting government be an agent of technology innovation and driver would be the 4 areas that I would emphasize.
Well, thank you very much, John, for very enlightening views and insights on very comprehensive areas and issues. Now, why don't I ask Dominique, would you like to add some more what you have already said?
I don't want to add too much. I was taking a lot of notes up here, and I agree with a lot of some of the themes I was just rattling off. What I wanted to do is focus on 2. But the notion of the right regulation, and I'm with what you said. I don't think it's about taking it away. It's just what's the right system you put in place to ensure it works. I think flexibility is going to be important. The data, how we manage data, not just the security aspect to it, but what's available or not. I think it's an asset class now. So how do we think about that? Ensuring the infrastructure is in place for this to all be able to happen. The public-private notion, I think there's a lot we can learn, I think, from what Korea has done through the decades in that, and not, again, picking winners, but I have to tell you I'm a fan of that type of industrial policy. But the one I just wanted to focus on, or 2, was around what Mr. Lee said. There's a very intriguing question about this. With this clock speed that's going on in technology and in the world, it's not just about business. It's just people just keep inventing. They just keep motoring. Our system of innovation in the public sector, I think, has to change, and that's I think one of the most difficult challenges in the world, because it's very constrained in how it does it. And that's what I worry the most about is the ability to think long term, because you're not going to get magic happening in the 2-year time frame you said, but it plays an essential role in making this work. But the clock speed this isn't a criticism; it's just a reality. It takes longer, and you just worry because the rate of the change that we're seeing here, we're going to see dislocation. I think what I worry the most about is if these 2 systems don't keep up with each other, then we get a huge amount of this situation of the winners and losers, and then we get then it gets worse for the public. So it's a big conundrum. And sort of what was going through my mind was thinking about in one of the previous industrial revolutions is what Bismarck did. Bismarck is the one that invented kindergarten. That didn't exist. That the whole and it was. Someone will correct me here, but I think moving from a agrarian world to a more of an industrial world where people are going to be working in a factory, you're going to have people learning about new things on a regular basis, not obviously at the speed we are. Kindergartens were set up, and I'm not saying that's the last big innovation we've had in the public. We've had a lot of good things, but I do think about that. The interesting thing is when you look at a kindergarten today in most parts of the world and you compare it to the pictures of 1881, there's not a big difference. The desks are made out of carbon fiber instead of wood, but so I think we need to really think about that public sector model. Innovation has to occur in a very constrained situation. And my final point is back to education. Your very powerful point about your 4-year-old, right? And I remember hearing Shimon Peres talk about saying, why do we keep 14-year-old boys and girls behind a desk for 8 hours? It just makes no sense but who's going to be willing to challenge the classic K-12? Because I would argue, I don't think that's the best system to be able to develop the skills that we need as we go ahead, but we're kind of rooted in that system. So and I can tell you, if government's hard to change, I think probably the hardest group of people to change in the world, and I look in the mirror, are people in education, who I deeply respect. But if you've ever tried to make change happen in a university, I'll guarantee you the scars on that person's back are bigger than any business person's back I've ever seen. It's difficult, let alone when you start messing with K-12. So I'm not giving any solutions. I just think those two areas we're going to have to get at in a serious way quickly because it's happening so fast. We don't have a generation to figure it out. I think it has to be done, in the next 5 years in big steps. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I invite some questions and comments from the floor, I would like to again, in the sense that to highlight again, underscore again what we've been discussing all day today. I think one of the consensus view and one of the general view regarding this forthcoming industrial revolution or currently progressing industrial revolution is that job turnover rate will be much, much higher than we ever experienced. And high job turnover rate have very significant implications on labor market and education. On regard education, as we've been saying here, is that the lifelong learning and the training and retraining and how you teach and the curriculum and so forth. But I sometimes think about why 4 years university now? Lifelong university. Those 4 years universities were designed to serve industrial age. Now lifelong learning and so from that perspective, this educational system has to be overhauled. Not only the way we teach and the way of education, and then industry and educational institutions collaboration for training and retraining. Continuous training and retraining is necessary because of this high job, job turnovers. And then that brings us to what do you want to do about social safety net? What do you want to do about those who don't have a job during the transition period? Again, we should do something about that too. So this, again, reminds me of a dictum strongly advocated by one of the Nobel laureates who they earned the Nobel Prize, I think, 2011. So Christopher Posadas, who is teaching at the London School of Economics. His dictum is this, I had hour-long discussion with him a couple of months ago at his office in London. His point is that protect workers, not protect jobs. Not jobs, workers. It has all very, very significant policy implications. As Mr. An talked about Korean shipping industry or steel industry, I think that one of the problems there is to protect jobs. Because some of jobs should disappear, but they try to keep their jobs by the labor union or the workers. Of course, we need social safety net to help them out during the transition period. But otherwise, they will just insist on keeping the jobs which should have been disappeared. Once you do that, what you're going to have is the company will make loss, and that will pile up. So there will be the serious consequence. And so this high job, the turnover rate, which is inevitable in this fourth industrial revolution, then this education reform and this, strengthening social safety net and the labor market flexibility. Without the labor market flexibility, how can you accommodate this so many jobs disappearing and so many jobs newly created? So to facilitate this, to win the competition in this fourth industrial revolution era, the policies should and the government policy particularly be ready to redesign the legal and institutional infrastructure, which is very, very important. So I think we all agree that education reform is the key, and labor market flexibility and the labor mobility is very, very important. So these are the big challenges. But again, who will do the best will win. Okay, with this, why don't I invite, James Rooney, yes. Just could you tell us who you are and try to make your comments and questions as brief as possible.
Some of you know who I am, so let me just introduce myself in this direction. 안녕하세요. James Rooney예요. Looks like a 외국 사람, but 진짜 한국 사람이에요. Thank you. Dr. Sagon, I will come back to you at the end. But first let me say that attending today's session has been too stimulating. You have all given us too much to think about. So forgive me if I have a few comments just to throw back at you as a result of your stimulation. The first is, I think, and I'll start with the small ones. People in Korea think of me as a financial expert or an investment manager or something like that. And investment managers talk about asset classes. And they say, stocks are an asset class, bonds are an asset class, and they go on with a long, long list. I was surprised and amazed as I moved out of Korea that I had to persuade foreign investment managers that cash is actually an asset class. But I fully agree with Dominic that the most valuable asset class is actually data. And it's completely underestimated how valuable data is. And from your slides, it's completely underutilized as well. Let's not forget that. The second thing was a shock to me because I haven't been paying attention. 미안합니다. I didn't realize that Korea, 20 years ago, proclaimed as the most connected country in the world, which I have spoken about many, many times, is actually the most obstructed country in the world because those connections go nowhere. We cannot reach the cloud. I am very connected. I have everything. My whole life is on this little piece of hardware, right? But yours has nothing on it.
At home we are connected. Only
exactly,
at offices.
Exactly. But we're talking about Kyungjae, about the Korean economy, about jobs. And I have a big passion for jobs, so forgive me for warming up to my passion. I'm surprised, and you're absolutely right. It needs to change. It needs to change real fast. This is not a competition. This is a participation. And without those connections all the way through, we cannot participate with other companies and other countries and realize our destiny. We don't have to be the winners. We have to be in the game. And this means we're not. And I'm very familiar with cloud computing and all its ramifications and economics and so on. And we're latecomers. We're not even sitting in the back of the bus. We're in the donkey cart behind the bus, and the bus is going twice as fast. We need to change that quickly. Pali pali. Another observation, as I listened to the speakers today, there was much talk about how this is all going to save on cost. Well, costs come down by a kind of law of gravity over time. And it's all very good to emphasize and focus on costs. But actually, I think the savings that all this will bring are going to be even more important in time. Time is the most precious thing. Cost, what does cost mean? It means dollars or Korean won or Chinese yuan. You can print some more of them. You can go get some more from the bank. But trust me, one thing that a few wise old men in this room know too well. You cannot go and get more time. Time, once it's gone forever. So time is the most precious thing, and actually that's where this is, I think, going to make the most difference. We just don't realize how it'll manifest yet. There was a lot of talk about this Internet of Things in the context of manufacturing and hard goods, and that's fine. But as we saw from KDI, the manufacturing sector in Korea is maybe 30% of the economy. The service sector is more than 50%. The hard goods that we think about are not as important today as the soft goods, the soft things. So let us not forget them in the rush. And I've always had to remind people in Korea that the chaebol are not anything like as important as you think. In total, the employment in the chaebol is probably less than 1 million persons. Less than 5% of the 25 million people working in Korea. The real employment comes from small and medium enterprises in Korea and everywhere in the world. That's where we need to inject the adrenaline. That's where the policymakers in the National Assembly, or perhaps the right phrase is, because Lee Jae-young has advised us that it doesn't happen fast, so maybe they're really the policy not makers.
Okay.
We don't need government to be policy not makers. The government is another obstruction in the way to the future. So I hope Mr. Lee will take support from my comment and find ways to remove those obstructions. Small and medium businesses, service sector, soft goods.
Others are waiting. Okay. So
I
I should
understand.
invite you to the panel next time. Yeah, please go ahead.
So,
I know how much to say. Yeah, but
observation along the way. Germany has been the success case. Korea has always done really well to learn from Germany. So I hope we will do that again. And coming to my final points, education and training. That's what jobs are all about, having skills. The problem is, and Lee Jae-young touched upon it for us, a Korean family worries about the college entrance exam. The education system in Korea, unfortunately, only trains people how to pass tests. They do not learn knowledge. They do not learn how to think. It is getting in the way. I serve as a professor at several universities in Korea. I've had to try and break that mindset with my students. And I'm very glad for two things today. One is that Dr. Sagong created this conference. And the second is that he also recognizes such importance to education and training, changing the paradigms, lifelong education, skill training instead of test passing. So Dr. Sagong, please take my thank you. And there are three wise old men here that have known each other for a long time. You and Dominic and I, and you and I. Let us please expect another 20 years from you. Please remain forever young. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, he has been here in Korea so long, and as he said, he's more Korean than average Koreans here. And thank you very much for your devotion and your contributions to our societal and economic progress and development. Thank you very much for that. Okay, now, yes, there is, yes.
예, 서울여자대학교 이성봉 교수입니다. 저기 안상훈 박사님하고 닥터 꿰리에게 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 그 안상훈 박사님께서 이제 그 4차 산업혁명과 관련해서 한국의 산업정책 방향이나 이런 부분을 좀 말씀해 주셨으면 좋을 것 같은 생각을 했었는데 그 방향만 살짝 보여주시고 마신 것 같아요. 그래서 제가 왜 이 말씀을 드리냐면 그 아까 닥터 꿰리께서 발표하신 내용에 보면은 독일의 이제 그 4차 산업혁명 관련해가지고 이제 그 독일 정부가 그 인더스트리 4.0을 정책을 피면서 사실 그 예산이나 이런 정책에 사용한 금액을 보면 1억 유로의 그 연구개발비만 투자를 했거든요. 사실 한국 돈으로 따지면 뭐 1,400억, 1,500억 정도밖에 안 되는데 한국의 그 산업정책이라고 하면은 지금 펑셔널한 측면의 그 산업정책 말씀하셨는데 두 번째 단계로 저희가 지금 그렇게 하고 있는 많은 R&D 투자들이 그 독일의 그 인더스트리 4.0의 그 1억 유로 가지고 굉장히 큰 효과를 보고 있는 그런 그 산업정책의 모습하고 우리나라의 그 굉장히 많은 돈을 투입하고도 실제적인 그런 그 어떤 산업의 구체적인 변화, 혁신 이런 것들은 아주 중소기업 레벨까지 내려간다고 했을 경우 소원한 그런 상황을 볼 때 과연 우리가 이런 산업 정책을 계속 가지고 가야 되는 것인지, 뭐 산업만 구조조정할 게 아니라 산업 정책도 구조조정해야 되는 게 아닌가 하는 생각을 가질 정도입니다. 그래서 제가 궁금한 거는 닥터 벨리께 여쭤보고 싶은 거는 독일의 그 정부의 산업 정책이라고 하는 것이 그렇게 돈을 적게 쓰고도 굉장히 좋은 효과를 낼 수 있는 그 근본적인 원인이 어디에 있는지 하고, 안 박사님께는 한국의 이 4차 산업혁명과 관련해서 향후 그 산업 정책의 방향은 어떻게 나가야 되는 것이 좋은지 좀 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
So, I think as I understood this Industry 4.0 vision of the German government is that it has two parts. One is that we spend a tiny amount of 100 million euros on sponsoring R&D projects, and the more important part is that there's a platform that has been created where business, so management, employees, the trade unions, scientists, all kinds of people, policymakers actually work together. They meet regularly and they develop an idea of where this is heading. Very important is the standardization of things, so that we're all on the same page. They develop test facilities where, say, the backbone of the German industry, the small and medium-sized enterprises, can actually test projects before they implement them. Because otherwise some of them claim not to be able to invest in these kinds of technologies, so they develop these testing grounds. And so this exchange is probably the secret behind this policy idea. It's not so much the money that has been invested into it. This is my understanding of that. There might be people who know much more about this than I do. And I'm not sure. I mean, it's hard to say at the moment if it has been successful. Evaluations I could not find, honestly. I looked for it, and there's no proper evaluation of that policy, and I wonder if that can be done in any way. But at least it seems that the German government has realized how important it is to take this on and to realize that Germany is the manufacturer of the machines for other countries that will be connected to each other and so on. And so to take leadership in developing this in a structured way, where all these issues of security and adoption and so on can all be discussed at the table with the stakeholders. I think that's the true secret behind this idea.
Okay, Dr. An.
I will answer in Korean because the question was in Korean. 지금 굉장히 중요한 지적을 하신 것 같은데요. 이렇게 보면 우리나라의 경제 성장이 투입량을 늘리는 데 의존한 경제 성장이었고, 그것이 지금은 한계에 봉착한 것처럼 우리의 경제 정책 혹은 산업 정책도 투입을 늘리는 데만 치중해 온 것 아닌가 하는 생각을 합니다. 그래서 혁신이 필요하다 그러면 거기다 예산을 많이 집어넣으면 좋은 결과가 나오겠다 하는 생각을 하고 정책을 그동안 집행해 왔던 것 같은데요. 그런 면에서 지금 이성봉 교수님이 말씀해 주신 것처럼 우리가 닮아야 할 독일은 우리보다 훨씬 적은 금액을 투입하고도 좋은 성과를 거두고 있다는 데 저희가 그것을 보고 많이 배워야 할 것 같고요. 지금 KDI하고 기획재정부에서 하는 것 중에 재정 지출의 효율화를 위한 연구를 많이 하고 있습니다. 영어로 하면 스펜딩 리뷰라고 부르는데요. 이를테면 일자리 창출 정책을 우리가 해서 15조에 가까운 돈을 들였는데 효과가 있었느냐. 그런데 같은 그런 고민을 일자리 창출 정책뿐만이 아니라 산업 정책, 또 R&D 정책, 그리고 지금 당장 하고 있는 것은 중소기업 정책과 사회 간접자본 투자에 대한 정책에 대한 분석을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 이런 노력은 다 뭐냐면 과거에는 투입을 늘리면 결과도 좋아질 것이라는 접근으로 많은 일을 해왔는데 지금은 그동안 해왔던 투입이 효과적이지 않았다는 반성도 있고 또 지금의 정부의 제약 하에서는 투입을 늘리기도 어려운 상황이기 때문에 그것을 저희가 고민해야 되는 시점인 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
Okay, last question or comments. Okay, there is a distinguished journalist, Don Kirk.
Yeah, my name is Don Kirk. I just was listening to some of the remarks, I got the impression that there was a widespread sense of praise for the job the Chebel were doing, although there may be some criticism, but also the Chebel are also often criticized for a lack of creativity, discouraging R&D, adopting other people's ideas. At the same time, the SMEs, which came in for some criticism, sometimes are viewed as the best and maybe even the only hope. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And one other point, there was a lot of emphasis on education, but there's a huge problem here in Korea of having too many overeducated people. Young people don't want to be steam fitters and carpenters and technicians, because that's all beneath them. So how do you rationalize that problem of excess education with the contempt or the lack of interest in educating people for jobs that are really needed to be done and that aren't getting done? Thank you for your insights on these two issues.
Anyone would like to respond?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think the point about the Chebel versus the SMEs is one that is substantially outside of my general expertise. Though I would say, the point I made about the Chebel was more in that this pure vertical integration play they have developed over many years could be, if used correctly, an enormous competitive advantage when you start talking about data as the oil, the oil of the fourth industrial revolution. And so I think, from my perspective, while the sort of business rigidity that exists within the Chebel could create real issues and has in the past, and indeed the institutionalized potential lack of creativity there could be if that can be overcome, they have this pool of beautiful data that could power them into the next generation. But I think South Korea has a very robust entrepreneur. Well, I guess I wouldn't say very robust, a growing, burgeoning entrepreneurial ecosystem. And if you look at even in the social space, between payments and messaging, there's a huge amount of innovation there. And so to leverage those together, I think would be the best opportunity. But I guess my comments about the Chebel specifically were more focused on the opportunity there, provided that cultural change can take place.
Okay. Any other? Dr. Han, you have anything to add?
I mentioned that industrial policy in Korea, especially in the 1970s, can be characterized as industrial policy as a public-private partnership. Actually, I spent 3 years at KDI PMAC, Public-Private Infrastructure Investment Management Center. And PMAC is a PPP unit for the Korean government in investment in infrastructure. And anyone who tried promote PPP will understand that it's very difficult, because unless the government give enough incentives, private sector will not be interested at all. So it will fail. But with some substantial amount of incentives, finally private sector comes in, but you will be criticized afterwards for having given too much incentives. Now, the Chebel problem is just like that. The government invited private sector and gave huge support for some business groups. Now, the problem is, for example, Samsung's most recent factory was not built in Korea, but built in Xi'an, China. Then taxpayers will wonder what the government has done. So that's a big problem for us now.
Yeah, okay. I just want to add to that whether Germany's Industry 4.0 or other the industrial policies. As I indicated earlier, I think nowadays industrial policy should be defined more broadly so that it would include all necessary structural reforms and the deregulations and so forth. And if you consider industrial policy from that perspective, there are some are costless. But all it takes is a political commitment and political leadership. And so that's why I think it is very critical. I keep saying that lawmakers and the legislature are very, very important because of social political reasons. There are so many regulations, particularly in service sectors, where we can generate so many high value-added jobs, high-paid jobs, as obstructed because of those regulations. And this fourth industrial revolution area, where, as Dr. Han alluded to, there are so many regulations which were made and suitable to earlier industrial age, not today and coming days. So that's why I just thought that the proceedings of this conference and discussions somehow can be fit into the legislative branch of Korea. In fact, as soon as this conference is over, we immediately start to transcribe all the discussions, and we will publish proceedings and distribute widely to, of course, the National Assembly, Blue House, and all the ministries, and the media, and editorial rooms, and so forth. And, of course, universities. Actually, today I purposely invited many university students to come to listen. So we will share what you have contributed at this conference with the large audience in Korea, policymakers and corporate level decision makers. Well, we can go on like this for all day and all evening, but I think we have to stop here, and some of the panelists have to catch a flight, and also we had a really long day. I really appreciate your really the long hours of attendance, and so I can see real hope for the Korea's future, because you've been sitting here all day. Well, with this, we have to end this very, very productive and worthwhile conference today. I again appreciate very much Dominic and McKinsey, and particularly my old friend John Zeisman. As he mentioned, again, in the late 90s, we held a conference on, again, semiconductor at that time. And since then, we've been friends. And thank you very much for organizing this conference and please participation. Well, and also, I thank all the panelists coming from Europe and America. It took a long way, and your contribution is highly appreciated. Thank you very much for the participation. With this, please join me in thanking all these co-organizers and participants, panelists.